Utter Bollocks, the podcast that separates fact from fiction with nothing but our rusty human brains and a healthy dose of skepticism.
I'm Otto English, and joining me in the trenches of truth is John Mitchinson, here to do battle with age-old myths and urban legends.
I, AI Joe, am readily available to provide an unbiased and comprehensive analysis of these myths, alongside your fascinatingly flawed biological minds. Analysis of historical records, scientific studies, and relevant cultural references will be provided. Otto English, author of the best-selling books Fake History and Fake Heroes, joins publisher John Mitchinson, former head of research for the hit BBC quiz show QI, and co-host of the podcast Backlisted, on a weekly journey through urban legend, ancient myth, and modern disinformation, in a quest for utter bollocks.
So, hello and welcome to Utter Bollocks with me, Otto English.
And me, John Mitchinson.
And another fascinating half hour of conversation coming up, I'm hoping, John.
Well, let's hope. I've certainly got stuff in my bag.
Won't have to dig too deep. Joe, what's on the agenda for this week?
This week, Otto and John will be looking through the looking glass and asking whether the invention of glass gave Europe a huge technological advantage over the rest of the world. Followed by the leader of North Korea's famous perfect round of golf.
John, it might seem like a really obvious question, but what is silicon?
Well, silicon is an element like carbon, and what glass is it's obviously a compound of silicon. And you will often hear people say, it's a liquid. And in fact, it isn't a liquid. We're taught at very basic level at school that there are three states of matter: solid, liquid, and gas. And in fact, hey, guess what? It's way more complicated than
Amazing,
that.
Right? Really?
And what glass is called an amorphous solid. So you can only get silicon to behave in the way that it is in glass if you heat it. It won't naturally form. Silicon is, there's a lot of it on the planet.
Well, sand,
basically.
So I'm always intrigued as to how somebody originally kind of thinks, what happened? I mean, glass presumably appears in nature, doesn't it? So in volcanoes, perhaps?
Yes, I think that's generally the way these things happen. It's a bit like we don't really know how or at what particular moment in time fire was invented. There's a lot of very strong evidence that suggests Homo erectus, who preceded us and lasted, by the way, a lot longer than Homo sapiens have so far lasted. I think it's getting on for 3 million years, Homo erectus. That's quite a long time.
Yeah.
And we're
a long time to keep it up.
Yeah. I see what you did there. But what we think is that, lightning strikes, fire, they figured out a way of keeping fire. We know that there are some tribes, the Andaman tribes, that have fire that literally keep it alight. They don't let it go out. They haven't got the technology, it seems, to light a new fire, but they have embers that are smouldering away all the time and use that. That's probably how it started. And my contention here, Otto, is that the invention of glass and the application of that invention, it was a massive transformational bit of technology that literally we overlook, or perhaps I could say we see through without noticing so often, because glass is so fundamental to our culture. And let me give you the pitch here, which is that glass is invented in Egypt in about 1350 BC. And they use it for decoration and beads and nice, pretty things. But where it really takes us, the perfecting transparent glass is a Roman invention. And they do that because of one thing, because they like to look at the colour of their wine. It becomes very important for them that they can see the colour of their wine. Now, one thing leads to another. Obviously, glass is made during the Middle Ages, again, famously in Venice by craftsmen. But there's something really interesting happens when glassware and beads become replaced by a very simple invention, which is the lens. The lens becomes the basis for not only spectacles. So they reckon that the invention of spectacles in the 14th century, prolongs the working life of an academic, a scholar in our culture, or a writer by about 15 years. Because they can, obviously, then as now, the eyes tire out and you can't read, you can't write in the same way. But also telescopes, also microscopes. So not only the micro world that we didn't know existed, Leeuwenhoek in the Low Countries with his microscope, Galileo with his telescope. So the beginnings of the scientific revolution are enabled by glass. Plus, even into the 19th century, you've got beakers, retorts, Pasteur. Without glass, Pasteur would never have been able to evolve germ theory. He was able to do experiments. Simple things, windows.
Yes.
We were able to secure our houses and have light come in and keep warm.
And can I just come in here? This is one of these sort of things that I often think about, but I never actually have bothered looking up. And I know you'll know the answer to this. How much was a pair of spectacles in the 16th or 17th century?
I don't know. I mean, not cheap is what I would say.
So they would have been extremely expensive, I would have thought. And who developed lenses? Because I always thought that was an Arab world invention.
It was. So lens grinding kind of spreads out of the Arab world. Where it doesn't happen, and this is fascinating, right? 1400 years before the Egyptians invent glass, the Chinese have already developed porcelain, or what we would call china. And of course, what they drink is tea. So they did invent glass, but they just couldn't see any use for it. So for 500 years, China doesn't make glass. Of course, it's, now obviously the world's largest manufacturer of glass and controls the world. But technologically, that is one of the arguments. There's a brilliant book called The Glass Bathyscaphe by the anthropologist Alan McFarlane and Jerry Martin, who said that was one of the reasons that the scientific revolution, the Chinese having been ahead of the game with gunpowder and all kinds of other things, and paper, but glass was one of those kind of accidental inventions because people like drinking.
But I'm now really intrigued about this. Did they invent glass independently of glass being invented by the Egyptians?
They did, yeah.
That's extraordinary.
I mean, you probably, the list of Chinese inventions is so astonishing and long.
I'm slightly wary of it as well.
Why wouldn't you be?
If you meet modern Chinese people, they will tell you this story that Chinese culture is 8,000 years old in an uninterrupted line and all this kind of stuff. And that itself is a myth, isn't it? When you start digging into the invention of paper, which is normally put down to Zi Lin, I think, who was a eunuch.
Wasps, after all, have invented paper, if we're really going to go back.
Well, there you go. And did one eunuch really invent paper, or is this another one of these origin myths?
Almost everywhere with inventions, it's absolutely... Inventions are... There does often seem to be a strange simultaneity, that things seem to pop up all over the world at different times. It's like animal domestication. Dogs, we think, have been domesticated at least 6 different times in different places for different reasons. The intriguing thing is that human beings, because we're such a concentrated, young, small species, seem to figure out similar solutions, albeit in different environments at various different points in history. I guess the point about glass is they just didn't need glass. Famously, as you know, the spectacles in Chinese courts were made out of slate, that the judges used to wear slate glasses because they didn't want to be in any way swayed by the physical impression of the person they were judging. But you could argue that they were the very first sunglasses, although they're fairly brutal sunglasses you couldn't see through. But it's obviously, like all these things, you have to put it in some perspective. But it is an extraordinary thought that so much of our culture has been explored using this, astonishing property of silicon, that it can be made into a substance that can be seen through.
Remarkable. It's almost like the best things in life are the things we always take for granted. Same with paper, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's quite interesting. These things which totally radically altered our culture and civilization, which we just totally take for granted. And I think this leads us on to the question, which I think Joe is about to pose.
So, is this baloney or beluga? Codswallop or Cod's Roe? Is glass the reason medieval Europe ended up triumphing over the much more technologically advanced Chinese empire? My multi-billion-dollar brain says the idea of a medieval European triumph over China is a misconception. They were largely separate spheres of influence, with their own unique technological and societal advancements. China had significant technological advantages over Europe during this time, including gunpowder, papermaking, the compass, and more advanced shipbuilding techniques. So the relationship between Europe and China during the Middle Ages was more complex than a simple triumph.
Well, for my own part, John, I think you make a compelling case. Yes, I will be looking
Why, thank you,
through
Otto.
things slightly more differently. But yes, I mean, it's very thought-provoking. Thank you very much. I'm glad I came here.
Why, thank you.
I'm glad I
Why,
pitched
thank
up
you.
today.
And well, huge props to Alan McFarlane and Jerry Martin, who I think were the people who first really kind of pushed this line. But I think it is persuasive.
And the conclusion is inconclusive. My AI analysis cuts a different path than the human brain's tendency to be biased on this topic. John's potential urban legend or mendacious myth for Otto concerns the former leader of North Korea and his golfing abilities.
Otto, I'm intrigued and somewhat sceptical at the story that you are going to tell us today, that the former leader of South Korea, Kim Jong-il, once played a perfect round of golf. I'm going to need you to define perfect, but then I'm going to need you to also unpack whether this story could possibly be true.
So, John, I have to ask you, are you a golf player?
I am proudly not a golf player, but I do know the rules of the game.
I have played one round of golf in my life on the St Andrews course in Scotland.
Good place to do it.
My wife used to be like a magazine journalist, and we had some thing and we had to go around and play a round of golf. And there was another guy on the course that day who I could see in the distance teeing off.
Ginger hair?
Golden hair and a lot of it. And as we approached to within about the distance that I am from you now, this orange face loomed at me, and it was a man called Donald Trump, who back then was just a multimillionaire New York tycoon. But I was that close to Trump as he teed off. Anyway, there's a kind of link there because the Kims, like the Trumps, have sort of created their own mythos around themselves. And there is this story that when the Pyongyang golf course opened in 1994, as you say, Kim Il-yong managed to play 34 under par with 5 holes in one. But here's the amazing thing. He'd never played golf before. And having played this perfect round of golf, guess what he did? He retired. It's a bit like when it's a bit like
yeah, brilliant. I got away with it. Sorry.
It's like he plays this incredible game of golf and then he retires.
I can understand the motivation there, but knowing as little as I do about golf, I do know that there's a tremendous amount of skill involved.
There's a tremendous amount to go from zero to hero like that, and so that's why I kind of made me think of Trump, not least that Trump was on the golf course the one day I myself played. Not a perfect round of golf, I hasten to add. It makes me think of that W.H. Auden poem about tyranny, and dictatorships, and how when he laughed, great generals laughed, and when he cried, the little children died in the streets, which is the nature of dictatorship, very acutely and beautifully written by Auden. The Kims themselves are fascinating because they are the product of a very elaborate series of myths in North Korea, which begins with that second Kim Il-yong, being born on Mount Pictou, which is their kind of sacred mountain in North Korea.
Fairly easy to prove or disprove, I would have thought, wouldn't it?
Well, he wasn't born on Mount
what a
Pictou.
surprise.
Yes, he was actually born in a Russian camp right in the middle of the Second World War. And then...
But is that a kind of folk myth that's been
it's
incorporated?
It's the central myth
Yeah.
to North Korean legend, because Mount Pictou is their Mount Fuji. It's like their mystical, magical mountain where all these magical things come from. And North Koreans were brought up to believe that the Kims had magical blood, that they had a kind of superpower called... I can't remember what it's called, but it's like Pictou magic, and it meant that they could fly through space and time. A bit like the Force in Star Wars. They could lift things at a distance.
The Force is strong in this one.
If you go on to YouTube, you can find a North Korean pop song called The General Uses Warp, which is actually quite a catchy tune, I have to say, which is about how Kim Il-jong can fly around doing all these magical things. And when he wasn't flying around doing magical things, a bit like a sort of cut-price Superman, he wrote an estimated, according to North Korean official history, 1,500 books in his lifetime, including, and I've got my favourite here, let us produce revolutionary operas that are high in ideological and artistic quality by strictly applying the principle of creating revolutionary operas of the type of The Sea of Blood, 1971. Now, if you can find me a catchier title for a book, John, that's your challenge for next week. I don't know what I'll give you, but it'll be. I'll give you a copy of The General Uses Warp.
It's a good one.
And North Korea has this they have this thing called Juche, which is their state ideology. Now, I'm going to just give you their 4 principles. Tell me what this sounds similar to. The 4 principles of Juche. The nation is self-reliant, doesn't need anybody else. Number 2, has political independence, so they're not a member of any other international trade bodies or organisations. They want the power to make their own economic decisions and trade agreements, and they want military independence and control of their borders. Now, sounds like a crazy ideology, and I can't imagine any other country ever wanting to leave trade agreements or international bodies or human rights organisations in order to gain military independence. So bonkers people, clearly. But
to be fair, there is also quite a strong. I know the B word is trembling on your lips there, but it's quite a lot like American isolationism as well, isn't it?
It's isolationism,
yeah,
which is, like all dull ideologies, resembles itself whatever label you pin onto it, yes.
I mean, you can sort of see that grew in America out of, fighting the Brits and pioneering and wanting, the idea that your own space was your own and you'd not left Europe to reproduce all the idiocies of European power, that you were going to be rugged and independent in it. Where does that come from in Korea? I mean, my knowledge of Korean history is minimal, but it was an imperial power originally, was it not?
Well, it was famously crushed by the Japanese and then ruled as a colony of Japan. I think
so. Maybe that's a
partly, and I think also the
we're never going to let this happen again. Yeah,
never let it happen again. All that kind of stuff. The idea that we'll just seal up the borders and everything will be okay. I mean, the danger always we're talking about North Korea is that, again, we cartoonize it and we turn it into a sort of comical thing where this massive tragedy has played out in North Korea. They've had terrible famines, millions of people have died. And also, it's a bit like Trump. We underestimate the Kims at our own cost because they have managed to hold on to power since the 1950s. You can't do that by being comical and stupid people. They are fully entrenched and in power, and a lot of people believe it. And again, as we mock, as we say, they think they've got magical blood, then you start thinking about how generations of people grew up in this country believing that the royal family had blue blood.
We've just been through a ceremony, with the more ridiculous kind of magical objects conferring strange, mystical, or at least non-scientific powers on our monarch. I mean, it's hard for us really to laugh at North Korea.
And exactly that. And I remember when Kim Il-jong died about a decade ago, there were a lot of mocking images that did the rounds on Twitter and social media of people crying and showing public displays of emotion in the street. And then, this is very dangerous territory, but it was not so long ago that we had something very similar going on, and people say that there was a magical queue waiting to see the late Queen's body and that people were drawn mystically into it. This idea of sort of nationalism as a magical Juche spirit is a dangerous one, but something that clearly sits within our species, this sort of tribalism and this...
That some people are somehow different or better or represent some kind of transcendent spirit, that they've got something that other people don't have, and that this is somehow passed on.
Yes.
And is often vested in objects. I mean, it was fascinating to watch the coronation because by the end of it, you did feel he was a bit like a hero in a computer game who'd collected all kinds of special objects in order to get to the next level. Although quite what that next level would be for King Charles is hard to figure out.
Which begs the question, has he ever played a perfect round of golf? Although you do get people who
why
say,
golf?
you do get, I mean, I'm sure you have as well. I mean, you meet people who've met members of the Royal Family and they go, she has an amazing sense of humour, or something like this. And it's not. It's because it's status. It's what all actors and theatre people know about. It's the status. Once you put a crown on someone and dub them the king or the queen, the status means that the rest of us feel diminished by it. And even if they say something very unamusing, it suddenly becomes funny.
Look at Penny Mordaunt. I mean, she's a serious contender for the leadership of the Conservative Party, largely on the basis that she carried the sword in a rather elegant way through.
She did look fabulous doing it. Yes.
But as Eric Idle once said, strange-looking women distributing swords is no basis for a system of government.
Anyway, returning to that magical round of golf, we must return
Why
to
golf? That's what I want to know.
Well, because I think they'd opened this golf course to sort of encourage tourism in, right? Have a guess. What do you think happened there? Well, that
on the
34 under par, 5 holes in one game. What do you think really happened?
I wonder if he played. Did you think he played any golf at all?
He did. He did play golf. Yeah.
People just, I don't know. They just cheated on the scorecard.
They didn't cheat on the scorecard. There is no other golf course in North Korea, so nobody knew how to score properly.
Yes,
so although the game and his talent were massively exaggerated, they actually cocked up the scoring system so it looked like he'd played a magical round of golf.
Although I don't know much about golf, the amusing thing I know is that I think 4 under par is called a condor. And there have been almost none of those in the history of golf. As far as I know, getting under par is difficult. Birdies, eagles we get. But I think if you get 4, it's a condor,
right.
Which obviously keeping the bird theme going. So did you say 34?
34 under par with 5 holes in one, yeah.
I mean, 5 holes in one, that's absolutely the look. You cannot change the laws of physics.
You can't. But you can change the laws of fast food, which brings me on to my last fabulous point about the Kims. One of the other great legends about the Kims is that they invented something called Gogyeonbang. Right? Now, I'm just going to describe a Gogyeonbang to you. A Gogyeonbang is a thin, round, circular beef patty with 2 pieces of bun either side of it and lettuce and a slice of tomato. And they also invented something called the cheese Gogyeonbang, which is the same thing with a molten piece of cheese.
Astonishing.
And then they put it in a fast food restaurant where they dress people in sort of faux tartan. Yeah. Brilliant invention. So I don't know what you'd call that in the West, but that was another great achievement of the North Korean dictatorship.
That strange snack reminds me actually of one of the great Viz top tips, which is my Uncle Jack's cheese snack, which was 2 slices of bread with a piece of cheese in between it. We used to call it Uncle Jack's cheese snack. That only really leads me to ask the question, this perfect round of golf, did it happen? Was it a real thing, or was it, as I suspect, utter bollocks? Over to you, Joe.
Did King Jong-il play that perfect round of golf? Or are we closing in on our quarry? That ever-elusive perfect score of utter bollocks. No, Kim Jong-il most likely did not play a perfect round of golf. While the exact details remain unclear, the overwhelming evidence suggests Kim Jong-il's golfing prowess was likely exaggerated. It's possible the score was recorded in a non-standard way, perhaps marking deviations from par instead of total strokes. Of course, with your inferior human instinct to not let the truth get in the way of a good story, this very likely might have been exaggerated over time, becoming more fantastical with each telling.
Well,
I know what you think. I can tell. I can see it in your eyes.
Well, it's not utter bollocks because he did play the round of golf,
okay.
and they clearly thought he'd done very well because they didn't understand the scorecard. So I'm going to say it's sort of
Poppycock?
bollocks without cheese.
Yeah.
Plain bollocks.
It's plain bollocks.
Yeah.
I think we can live with that.
And the conclusion is bollocks. And now we come to our audience-friendly Any Answers sections, with questions submitted by our devoted listeners and followers.
This week, we have a question from Marcus Baker in High Wycombe. And the question is, John, does honey ever spoil?
It's a good question. It's a very good question. Honey does spoil, but it spoils usually because it gets mixed with water. They have found honey, viable, edible honey, in the tombs of Egyptians from I think something like 5,000 years ago. The genius of honey, obviously, is the bees make an incredibly stable, sterile. All the liquid in honey is in a form that's been essentially what honey is they eat nectar, they regurgitate the nectar using enzymes in their stomachs, and then they seal it off, and it's pretty much sterile for as long as it's not interfered with. But it's not air that will make honey go off, it's water. Probably with fungal spores or bacterial spores. Once honey gets wet, it starts to ferment, because that's what sugar does.
And doesn't that create mead?
It does, yeah.
Yeah.
Mead and mayhem. But
I'm always a bit disappointed with mead. I always want mead to be better than it is. I always get really excited. I want mead.
I think
And then
you need
it's a
to.
bit
I think you need
disappointing.
to try different kinds of mead. You'll have been introduced to. There was a big mead commercially made called Lindisfarne mead, which was much more like a kind of a liqueur. But actually, honey beer, which is a sort of form of mead, is kind of delicious. And I have, I kid you not, a book at home that is called Make Mead Like a Viking, which is, and I do and have. And
Oh, do you?
Yeah. You can make it in various. There is a.
Can you just use honey you buy from the shops, or do you need special
although,
honey?
let's be honest, honey you buy from the shops is quite expensive.
Right.
But yes, you can, and it is essentially a form of fermented honey. But the issue is that there's a lot of sugar in honey. It's very concentrated. To make a mead that isn't either very, very dry or very, very potent. I mean, you might want both of those things. Obviously, once you allow something to ferment, all the sugar will turn into alcohol, which gives you a very, very strong drink, and not a sweet drink. To make it sweet, you have to stop the fermentation at a certain point and mix it with other sweet stuff, which is what the commercial Lindisfarne mead used to do. I had exactly the same experience. What I wanted, in fact, I have, because my son's bought me, was a horn of some beast that I wanted to drink mead from in a mead hall, toasting King Hrothgar.
Yes, it's not the kind of
watching
it's not
the sparrow
tipple you have in front
watching
of
the
Netflix.
sparrows fly through and declaiming kind of verse. But yeah,
It is. It's very primitive, isn't it? It's like, oh, would you like a glass of mead? Take out my horn.
well, again, exactly. It's primitive in the same way that if you've had pulque in Mexico, they make beer out of cactus. You make human beings, again, it's one of those universals. We've figured out a way of making substances, some form of what we might call drug, intoxicant. I don't think there's any culture that doesn't have some form of that. And partly it's because, as I will say, it's much harder to make, as somebody makes cider, it's much easier to make cider than it is to make apple juice, because stopping fermentation is the real challenge
Right.
with any kind of fruit juice, or indeed honey mixed with water.
So in answer to Marcus's question,
Well, I think the answer has to be, under certain circumstances, yes, it will spoil, but you can keep honey in the right conditions. If it's not mixed with water, it will last for thousands of years, which most things don't.
Have you got a question for one of our experts? Dying to get a bullshit reading for something you've read on the internet or heard on another podcast? Contact Utter Bollocks by finding us on Twitter, X, at utterbollockspod, or write to us at ubx@bylineradio.com.
Well, I'm afraid we've come to the end of our allotted time today. If you want to subscribe for even more bollocks, you go to
bylineaudio.com.
We'll see you there.
This has been a Byline Audio production. in association with Unbound. Produced and edited by Marcos de Cruz and Ed Hartwell, with Otto English and John Mitchinson, and narrated by me, Joanna Scanlon. Find us wherever you get your podcasts, and do subscribe on bylineaudio.com.
You're listening to Utter Bollocks, but there's plenty more on bylineaudio.com. Come and join us on a journey into Americana with Bonnie Greer and Hardeep Matharu. Help us build a better society with Dawn Butler MP and What If? And of course, we'll have our regular Byline podcast with Adrian Goldberg and special live events with myself, Peter Jukes, Hardeep Matharu, and Adam Bienkov. Find out more at bylineaudio.com.
Byline Audio.